What drove a man to destroy his entire family in cold blood? The truth, as they say, can be deadly. What began as an ordinary evening turned into a nightmare no one could have predicted. When Chris uncovered the truth about his son's paternity, it shattered the illusion of a perfect life, setting in motion a horrific tragedy that would claim the lives of those he once loved. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Queens, New York, life seemed to be moving along as usual for the Carter family. They were a picture of the American dream. Chris, the father, a hard-working insurance agent; Jennifer, the mother, a teacher at the local middle school; and their two children, Luke and Emma, both in their early teens. On the outside, their home looked just like any other, a neat, tidy house with a well-maintained garden, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air each morning, and the sound of laughter echoing from within. Chris had always prided himself on providing for his family. He was a man who worked long hours, always bringing home a paycheck and ensuring his loved ones lacked for nothing. Jennifer, equally devoted, cared for the children, ran the household, and supported Chris in every way she could. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Carters were a family who had it all, a perfect life that many would envy. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Chris had always felt a slight unease that he couldn't quite explain, a nagging thought that would cross his mind every now and then. It was nothing concrete, just a fleeting feeling that perhaps things were not as perfect as they appeared. The feeling had been there for years, buried deep, but it was on a crisp autumn morning in October of 2018 that everything would come crashing down. It started with a simple test. Chris, like many fathers, had always wondered about the similarities between himself and his children. He loved Luke and Emma fiercely, but there was something about their mannerisms, their personalities, that never quite lined up with his own. They shared Jennifer's bright blue eyes, her slender frame, and her gentle demeanor. Chris, on the other hand, was dark-haired, with a muscular build and a temperament that tended to be more direct, even abrasive at times. Over the years, these subtle differences had piqued his curiosity, but he brushed them off as mere coincidences. That morning, as he left for work, his mind was preoccupied with the thought. He had stumbled upon a website that offered genetic testing for people curious about their family history. It was a harmless enough service, just a simple DNA test to uncover ancestry and determine genetic traits. With a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, Chris ordered the kit, not expecting it to alter the course of his life. Weeks passed, and the package arrived. At first, it felt like just another task to check off his list. He followed the instructions carefully, collecting his saliva sample and sending it off to the lab. It wasn't until the results came in that everything changed. The email notification arrived on his phone while he sat at his desk at work, and Chris opened it without much thought. But as he scanned the report, his heart began to race. The results weren't what he expected. Chris stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what he was reading. The test had determined that he was not the biological father of Luke. The shock was enough to stop him cold. He blinked and reread the words, disbelief clouding his mind. There had to be some mistake. After all, he had been with Jennifer for years. He had witnessed the births of both Luke and Emma. He had been there for their first steps, their first words, their school performances. How could this be true? As the hours passed, the initial shock began to fade into something darker. Questions began to swirl in his mind. Questions he hadn't wanted to ask, but now could not ignore. If Luke wasn't his son, then who was? And how had Jennifer kept this secret from him for so long? Chris could barely focus on work that day. He sat at his desk, replaying the moment over and over in his head. He thought about Jennifer, about their relationship. They had been married for 15 years, their bond built on trust, love, and mutual respect. How had this happened without him knowing? And why hadn't she ever said anything? He called Jennifer that evening, his voice steady but filled with an edge he couldn't disguise. He told her about the test results, about what he had learned, and asked her to come home early so they could talk. When she arrived, the conversation was brief but intense. Jennifer, her face pale, admitted that there had been a mistake. She claimed the test was faulty, that the company had likely made an error. She promised that Luke was still his son in every way that mattered. that the love between them had never changed. But Chris wasn't convinced. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the nervous twitch of her lips. There was something in her voice that didn't match the words she was saying, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. He demanded answers, wanted the truth. That night, he stayed up late, pacing the living room floor, his mind racing. The images of their life together, of their children, of their happy moments, began to warp in his mind. How many lies had been told? How many secrets had been kept? For the first time in years, Chris felt completely unmoored, betrayed by the one person he had trusted above all else. The next morning, Chris made a decision. He couldn't live with this uncertainty. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He would confront Jennifer, demand the answers he had been avoiding for so long. As he sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling, he wondered if he was ready for what he was about to discover. The following days were a blur of emotions. Chris continued to press Jennifer, seeking the truth with a desperation that surprised even him. The cracks in their marriage began to show, and Jennifer, unable to keep up the facade any longer, finally confessed. She revealed that Luke was not his biological son, but her own dark secret went much deeper than that. She had been unfaithful to Chris, had slept with another man while they were trying to conceive, and Luke was the result of that affair. The revelation shattered Chris. The pain was excruciating, a deep wound that no apology could heal. For the first time, he felt a rage that threatened to consume him. The betrayal was not just from Jennifer, but from life itself. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, felt like a lie. As Chris absorbed this truth, his mind began to cloud with anger and despair. He had spent years raising a child who wasn't his, and now he found himself questioning everything. Was his entire life just an illusion? Could he ever trust anyone again? That night, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with tension. The once warm home now felt cold and oppressive, as though the walls were closing in on Chris. He couldn't let go of the rage, couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal, and as he lay in bed beside Jennifer, the weight of his emotions felt unbearable. He stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The night after Chris had confronted Jennifer, he could hardly sleep. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't push away. He replayed every moment from the past 15 years, every smile, every family gathering, every shared moment of joy, now tainted by the realization that it had all been built on a foundation of lies. Jennifer's confession, though truthful, felt incomplete. The betrayal was staggering, but the unanswered questions loomed over him like an insurmountable mountain. Jennifer tried to reach out to him in the days that followed. She begged for forgiveness, apologized repeatedly, her voice breaking each time she spoke. She tried to explain that her actions had been driven by weakness, by a momentary lapse in judgment during a particularly rough patch in their marriage. She claimed that she had always loved him, that Luke's biological father was a man she had met at a work conference, a man she had never seen again, not even once after their brief affair. But for Chris, none of this mattered anymore. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything that came after, the years of raising a child who wasn't his, of loving him as his own, of thinking he was doing everything right, only to find out that he had been living a lie all along. The anger that churned inside him wasn't just aimed at Jennifer. It was aimed at the entire world that had allowed him to live in this fabricated reality for so long. Jennifer had tried to make things right by suggesting they go to counseling, to work through the pain together. She even suggested a DNA test for Emma, but Chris didn't need that. He already knew that Emma, unlike Luke, was his biological daughter. That fact brought him little comfort, though. What mattered to him now was the betrayal that had shaken him to his core. What would you do if the truth you thought you knew was suddenly turned upside down? Could you handle the devastating consequences, or would it push you to the edge? Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more interesting documentaries. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the household grew unbearable. Chris couldn't look at Jennifer without feeling disgust. Each time he saw her, his mind would race back to that moment of confession. The coldness in her voice as she spoke of her infidelity, the lack of remorse in her eyes as she told him about her one-night affair. He realized then that the woman he had spent his life with wasn't who he thought she was. There were so many layers to her deception, so many parts of their life that had been carefully hidden beneath a facade of love and loyalty. He began to wonder if he had ever truly known her at all. He distanced himself from the family, spending long hours away from home, at work or just driving around the city. He needed space, he needed time to think, but every time he came home, the walls seemed to close in on him tighter. It was as if the house itself had become a prison, and Jennifer was its warden. Her pleas for forgiveness only irritated him, reminding him of how broken their family had become. Luke, too, seemed to sense the shift in the air. The once cheerful boy, who would greet his father with a smile and a hug when he came home, now avoided him. He kept to himself more and more, often retreating to his room, where Chris could hear the faint sound of music blasting through the walls, his son drowning out the reality of their fractured home. Chris couldn't blame him. He had been a good father to Luke, hadn't he? Yet now he wondered what kind of father he had been. The pain of not being Luke's biological father was one thing, but the guilt of not truly understanding his son's inner world, of not realizing the emotional toll this secret had been taking on him, was another. The days bled into one another, and Chris became a man consumed by anger and confusion. He stopped coming home early from work. He stopped answering Jennifer's calls, his emotions too raw to deal with her anymore. His isolation grew, and soon it wasn't just the marriage that felt strained. It was the whole fabric of his life. The truth that had been exposed to him had broken something deep within, and what hurt the most was that no one seemed to care. Chris's mind, clouded by resentment, began to wander down dark paths. It was a dangerous place to be, but he couldn't stop himself. He became obsessed with the thought of revenge. He thought about how easy it would be to disappear, to leave everything behind, to walk away from the pain and the lies. He wondered if that would give him the relief he so desperately craved. But no, that wasn't enough. Revenge was what he wanted. It consumed him. He wanted to make Jennifer feel the same gut-wrenching betrayal that he felt every waking moment. He wanted her to understand the pain that had been inflicted on him, to know what it felt like to have everything ripped away from her. The family dynamic continued to deteriorate. Luke's distance only made Chris feel more isolated. The boy wouldn't speak to him anymore. It was as if Chris had become a stranger, an outsider in his own home. Chris began to view him differently. Luke wasn't his son. He was a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Chris would sit at the dinner table, his eyes fixed on the boy who, despite being raised in his home, was nothing more than a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered his world. Jennifer, despite her attempts to hold the family together, was helpless. She tried to reach out to Chris with love, with words of apology and sorrow, but they had no effect. Chris didn't want her apologies. He didn't want anything from her anymore. He was beyond saving now. One night, as the tension reached its breaking point, Chris found himself in the kitchen, alone. The house was eerily quiet. Luke was in his room. Jennifer had gone to bed early, leaving Chris alone with his thoughts. The rage that had been simmering inside him for weeks finally boiled over. He could no longer ignore the thoughts that had been festering in his mind. The thought of vengeance, of taking control of the situation, overwhelmed him. He wasn't going to let them, his wife and son, get away with it. The sense of justice that had once guided him in life now felt distant. It no longer mattered. What mattered was his anger, his need to feel in control again. In that moment, Chris made up his mind. He had been wronged, and he was going to make them pay. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. The rage that clouded his judgment was all-consuming. He didn't even think about the impact his actions would have on Luke or Jennifer, or the life they had built together. The only thing that mattered now was his desire for retribution. And so, on that night, October 18th, 2018, Chris Carter's life would take a dark and irreversible turn. The air in the house felt heavy that night, thick with the tension that had built up over weeks of constant conflict. Chris moved silently through the darkness, his steps deliberate and controlled. He had already made up his mind, and now it was only a matter of executing his plan. The events that would unfold next were a tragic testament to the fact that in moments of intense emotional turmoil, people are capable of unspeakable things. At first, Chris considered confronting Jennifer directly. He could feel the rage still simmering under the surface. Anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming need to assert some form of control over a situation that had spiraled out of his hands. He wanted her to feel his pain, to know that he had been shattered by her lies. But as he paced the kitchen, his mind began to shift. Confronting Jennifer would be too easy. It wouldn't give him the satisfaction he sought. Instead, he wanted to hurt her in a way that she could never undo. He paused for a moment, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight, and the house was silent. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustling of leaves outside. Luke was still in his room, probably lost in his own world, shutting out the chaos around him. That was good. Chris had no intention of waking him just yet. His eyes flicked toward the stairs, leading to the bedrooms. The thought of going upstairs to face Jennifer and Luke, the woman who had deceived him and the boy who was never really his, filled him with a cold, numbing determination. He wasn't sure how it had come to this, but he knew it couldn't go on any longer. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was consumed by something darker. There was no turning back. Moving quietly, he ascended the stairs, one step at a time, as if the act itself was a slow, deliberate process. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic beat a harsh reminder of the gravity of what he was about to do. He reached the top of the stairs and crept toward the bedroom door, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the handle. Inside, Jennifer lay asleep, unaware of the storm that was about to break over her. Her breathing was steady, and for a moment Chris hesitated. He could almost hear the echoes of their past, the love they had once shared, the years they had spent building a life together. But all of that seemed so distant now, a distant memory that had been eclipsed by the weight of the truth. She had lied to him, and that was something he could never forgive. He entered the room, his movements slow, calculated. He had no plan of what would come next. He wasn't thinking clearly, his mind clouded by anger and confusion, but there was a sense of finality in his steps, as if this was the only way he could regain control. The knife, cold and heavy in his hand, felt like a symbol of the power he no longer had in his life. It was his only means of taking back what had been taken from him. As he stood over her, staring down at the woman who had once been his partner, he felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to wake her up, to scream at her, to make her face the consequences of her actions. But the other part of him, the part that had been suffocated by years of lies, knew that there was no more room for dialogue. Words had failed him. Trust had failed him. What was left then but to take matters into his own hands? Without a sound, he brought the knife down. The moment the blade made contact, everything seemed to freeze. The quiet of the room, the stillness of the night, all vanished in an instant. Jennifer's body jerked in surprise, a muffled gasp escaping her lips as she woke to the horror unfolding. She didn't have time to react. Chris didn't allow her that luxury. The rage inside him surged forward with brutal force, each movement a release of years of pent-up emotion, years of betrayal that could no longer be contained. In the silence that followed, there was nothing but the sound of Jennifer's struggling breaths, gasps that grew weaker with each passing second. The world outside seemed to fade into oblivion, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was the act of finality, the one thing that could put an end to his pain. But the horror didn't stop there. Chris could hear Luke stirring from his room. The muffled sounds of his feet hitting the floor echoed down the hall, followed by the faint creak of the floorboards. He could feel the boy's presence moving toward the stairs, unaware of the nightmare unfolding upstairs. For a moment, Chris considered stopping. He considered letting the boy remain in his safe little bubble, away from the tragedy that had just unfolded. But that wasn't an option anymore. He had made his choice, and Luke was just as much a part of it as Jennifer. Chris's mind had already decided. There was no going back. He wasn't going to allow any remnants of the life he had known to survive. The sound of Luke's footsteps grew louder as he approached the top of the stairs, and Chris turned his attention toward the boy. He couldn't look at him. He couldn't bear to see the son he had once loved with all his heart. The boy who had once made him proud was now a symbol of his greatest betrayal. Chris's hands trembled as he moved towards the door, ready to finish what he had started. Luke paused at the threshold of the bedroom door. There was a momentary stillness, a breathless silence, before he stepped inside. His eyes locked onto the scene before him, and for the first time, Chris saw the fear in his son's eyes. The innocence, the trust that Luke had once had, evaporated in an instant. In that one moment, everything changed. Luke froze, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. He didn't understand the full extent of the tragedy unfolding before him, but he knew enough to realize that something was terribly wrong. His father's eyes, once filled with love, now bore the unmistakable mark of madness. Chris took one last look at Luke before his mind shut down entirely. His actions no longer made sense, not in the way they had once been grounded in some twisted logic of justice or revenge. It was as though he had become something else. A man stripped of all humanity and replaced by pure destruction. In the days that followed, there would be no explanation that could undo what had happened. There would be no excuse, no way to justify the bloodshed that had unfolded inside that quiet suburban home on the evening of October 18, 2018. Chris's family, once whole, would now be forever shattered, victims of a man who could no longer tell the difference between love and rage. The morning that followed the horrific events was eerily calm. The early rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting a pale light over the house. Yet, inside, everything had been irrevocably changed. The house, which had once been a symbol of family, warmth, and normalcy, now sat in an ominous silence. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the violence and despair that had taken place only hours earlier. Chris, standing amidst the wreckage of his life, couldn't feel the weight of the horror he had unleashed. In that moment, he was numb to everything. Numb to the blood that still stained his hands, numb to the broken bodies of the people he had once loved. His mind was clouded with a fog that prevented him from fully processing what had happened. There was no room for guilt, no room for remorse. All that remained was the desperate need to escape, to distance himself from the irreversible damage he had done. For a long while, Chris simply stood motionless, as though the world outside the house no longer existed. His thoughts were scattered and incoherent, as if he were drifting in and out of consciousness. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder in his ears, reminding him that time was slipping away. The hours that had passed since the violence seemed to stretch indefinitely, the horror settling deep within him like an anchor dragging him toward an uncharted abyss. His hands, covered in blood, trembled as he wiped them against his pants. The sight of his family lying lifeless in front of him should have repulsed him, but it didn't. Instead, it fueled the numbness that was rapidly consuming him. He didn't feel grief, nor did he feel the weight of his actions. He only felt an overwhelming emptiness, as though he had lost a part of himself he could never regain. When the authorities arrived, it was far too late. The damage had already been done. The bloodshed was a trail that led back to Chris, and the evidence of his horrific deeds was unmistakable. No one had known what was coming. The neighborhood had been unaware of the underlying tensions that simmered behind closed doors. Chris's outbursts, his violent rage, was a terrifying revelation to everyone who thought they knew him. The quiet, unassuming man who had once greeted his neighbors with a smile was now the monster who had killed his family. Detectives and forensic experts worked tirelessly to piece together the details of the crime. Evidence was collected, photographs were taken, and the house was combed for any clues that could explain what had led to such an unimaginable act of violence. But the truth was clear to anyone who saw the scene. This was no random act. It was personal, fueled by a betrayal so deep it had twisted Chris's perception of reality. Jennifer's body, lifeless on the floor, told the tragic story of a woman who had been caught in a web of deceit. Her once beautiful face was now marred by the brutality of Chris' hands, her life taken in the most senseless of ways. Her death, as tragic as it was the result of a series of choices, decisions that had been made over time and culminated in this terrible night. But the true tragedy lay in the fact that she had been completely unaware of the horror that awaited her. Luke's body, too, was found nearby. The child, only 12 years old, had been a mere bystander in his father's twisted path of destruction. There were no words that could describe the pain of losing a child in such a senseless manner. Luke had been innocent, caught up in a situation that was beyond his understanding. His life had been taken before it had even truly begun, a victim of circumstance in a world that could be both beautiful and unforgiving. The police, who arrived at the scene, were shocked by the brutality of the crime. Chris, sitting in the living room, was apprehended without resistance. He was calm, almost eerily so, as he was handcuffed and read his rights. There was no fight left in him, no attempt to explain or justify his actions. He had already crossed a line from which there was no return. The man who had once been a husband, a father, was now a killer, one whose reasons would never be enough to explain what he had done. In the days that followed, the media descended on the small suburban town, eager to unravel the mystery of the family's brutal end. News outlets ran headlines of the shocking crime, while reporters lined the streets in search of answers. People who had known Chris, who had once considered him a friend and a good neighbor, were left reeling from the news. No one had suspected that something so monstrous could come from someone they thought they knew. Chris's trial began months later. The courtroom was filled with spectators, all eager to see the man responsible for the massacre face justice. His defense lawyers tried to argue that Chris had been overwhelmed by the shock of learning the truth about his son's paternity. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a man who had been consumed by jealousy and rage, whose actions had been premeditated and deliberate. The evidence was damning, and the jury had little doubt as to what had happened that fateful night. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that Chris's mental state had deteriorated over the months leading up to the murders. He had been consumed by anger and distrust, unable to reconcile the truth with the life he had built. His fixation on the lie about Luke's paternity had poisoned his mind, and in the end, it had led him to destroy everything he held dear. His defense tried to argue that he had been experiencing a mental breakdown, but the prosecution countered, presenting the carefully executed nature of the crime as evidence of Chris's awareness of what he was doing. Chris was ultimately found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were harsh, condemning Chris for his actions and the devastation he had caused. But the sentence was little comfort to those who had lost everything. The family's tragic end had forever altered the lives of those left behind. The community, forever marked by the violence that had unfolded within its walls, struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Neighbors and friends mourned the loss of a family that had once seemed so ordinary, so full of promise. The scars of that night would remain with them forever, a reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets can remain hidden until it's too late. Chris's life, once filled with possibilities, was now nothing more than a series of broken dreams and irreversible actions. The lives of Jennifer and Luke, who had once been the heart of his world, were lost to him forever. The questions of why and how would never truly be answered. What remained, in the end, was a legacy of pain, a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of secrets and the dangers of betrayal. If you were left in the same position, would you snap, or would you try to make sense of the madness? If you want to hear more chilling true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.